Awesome. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to take a moment for everyone to log in and join the call. So we'll start in about 30 seconds. So, feel free to get settled. If you're still joining us, take a moment. It's okay. I also want to say thank you so much to those of you who tuned in last month. We had a really great discussion on the recent MITRE attack evaluation. So I definitely encourage you, go to the Uptycs website, check that out, share that around if you're at all interested in the MITRE attack evaluations, kind of how we incorporate that into our own UI, or just in general, what was the topic of this year's evals. This month, though, we have a really exciting session on cloud entitlements, and I have two fantastic panelists I'm excited to introduce. So let's go ahead and introduce them. Hey, Andre. Hey, Sudarsan. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really, really excited to have you both on this month's Uptycs Live. You both have a really interesting background, and yeah, why don't you each just take a moment and introduce yourself. Andre, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so my background is a little not unique, but just followed the path of being in the managed hosting space with Rackspace for about 7 years, leading network security teams, and then transitioning to AWS. I was at AWS for 5 years. Recently joined Uptycs about 6-7 weeks ago, and while I was at AWS, I oversaw the account takeover division within the AWS Fraud Prevention group.
That's awesome. Yeah, you have so much great experience kind of coming into this Uptycs role. So I'm really excited for you to kind of share a bit of that background with us. Yeah, thanks for that great introduction. So Sudarsan, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for bringing us to this session. So I've been in Uptycs for close to a year, helping our founders achieve their vision around cloud security. Before coming to Uptycs, I primarily spent a lot of time at RSA and Symantec, more around the IAM space, including access management, authentication, authorization across the hybrid multi-cloud environments.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to have you on this month's Uptycs Live to really evangelize the product you've been working on. You do so much great stuff around here, so I'm really excited to have you here. So yeah, a quick introduction about myself, everyone. I'm a technical product marketer here at Uptycs. Prior to Uptycs, I worked on security operations and systems engineering for government clients. And yeah, in my spare time, I enjoy playing and watching soccer. So before we get into it, though, I have a few fun rapid fire questions just to kind of break the ice, have some fun, and get to know each of you a little more. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What is your favorite movie? And then what is the best dish that you can cook? Sudarsan, let's go ahead with you.
My favorite movie is Top Gun.
Okay, nice.
I'm looking forward for the next series coming up. And I love making oven pizzas for my kids. I started from the scratch, and they tell me I make the best pizza they ever had. So that's awesome to hear.
Really? Do you have a whole pizza oven set up? Like you
Yeah.
got you got a pizza oven?
Yeah.
Okay, that's so cool. All right, well that's pretty fun. Andre, what about yourself?
I would say movie is Back to the Future series. There's just something about it that is nostalgic, and then just the storyline is just so well put together. Favorite food is probably scallops and some veggies. I lived in Seattle for close to 5 years. We go down to the market there, buy fresh scallops, learn how to cook them, and cooked right, they're absolutely delicious.
That's really cool. Yeah, I feel like it takes a delicate touch. So I bet you can cook some other stuff really well too if you're cooking scallops like that. So okay, really impressed off the bat. But maybe let's take a look at the agenda for today. So we have a really exciting session today and a lot to cover. So I'll quickly go over this slide. A few housekeeping items. This webinar is expected to go around 30 to 35 minutes. We just finished those introductions, so thank you, Andre and Sudarsan. The webinar itself, though, will be split into 2 sections. First, a panelist-style discussion with Andre and Sudarsan for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then second, a demo walkthrough led by Sudarsan for the last 5 to 10 minutes. So the discussion itself will break down into 3 sections you can see here. First, focusing on industry pitfalls around cloud identity. Then moving into thinking like a threat actor and really understanding the cost of not addressing these identity gaps that we talked about in the first section. And then finally, we're going to bring it all together to implement some solutions. And what does it mean to operationalize recommendations in the cloud? Then at the final stage, we'll do the live demo. We'll get into that fun stuff with the live demo led by Sudarsan, showing off how we actually implement the conclusions from the discussion. So we left time at the end for an open Q&A, but of course, please ask questions along the way. We'll keep an eye on that questions box down below. And yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So just to kind of set the stage a bit and make sure we're all using the same language, Sudarsan, what is this space of identity and entitlement analytics? And for you, what are some of the top identity and entitlement related risks or threats that we should really consider when we think about this?
Absolutely. There are two parts to this question, Jeremy. So the first one is from a market perspective. The way the industry characterizes this space is it's basically a full stack security analysis, including the visualization of the permissions, determining the effective access across all types of identities, including both human and machine, and eventually prioritizing those identity-specific risks based on the full security analysis. Right? A sample use case that I can think of is which identity can do the most damage to my cloud resources, and how many such identities exist in that environment, and how do I prioritize that. Right? That's a sample example of how the industry views this space. The second question that he talked about, what are some of the top threats? So the biggest threat that I can imagine is how do you understand the dangerous relationship across your accounts or resources within your environment or within your business partners, right? If you have vendors and your third-party identities that coming and connecting to your cloud, how do you make sure that a zero trust principle applied across those identities when they make the connection to the cloud? That's the first risk that I have seen. The second one is around the overall attack surface is so big that you completely forget about the principle of least privilege. That has been in the industry for quite some time, but getting to that is by itself is a challenge. If you do not get to the least privilege, then you're exposing your entire surface to attack. That's some of the examples that I can think of from a risk perspective for identity and entitlements.
No, that's really helpful. And I think just to kind of hone in on one of the last things you mentioned for the idea of least privilege, kind of the trouble with that with the size of the cloud. One question I have kind of as a quick follow-up to that is, why is identity just so complex in the cloud world? And really, what does complexity mean when we think about it?
Yeah, so IAM is one of the key underlying fabrics that stitches all the services within a cloud. Take, for example, AWS has hundreds of services. All of these services come together where IAM is the common fabric. Any service within the cloud, any cloud provider is just one API call away, right? The only thing that stands between the services API being accessible by a defender or an attacker is your IAM policies and how they have been set up. So one of the complexities arises from the type of policies that we talked about. There are 6 or 7 different types of policies, and every identity inherits those policies. And how do you bring all this together and interconnect by itself is basically a big challenge for customers. The other part that makes it more complex is the shared responsibility model. Most of the customers that I've talked to have not a clear understanding of where do their responsibilities stop and where does AWS responsibility starts from protecting or detecting any specific security threats. So those two together creates a lot more complexity when it comes to adopting a cloud and even reducing the risk in the cloud itself.
No, that's really helpful. And I think that mention of AWS is a perfect segue to bring you in now, Andre. I'm really curious your thoughts on this idea of complexity and really what's your perspective on what customers are struggling with today based off of your experiences.
Yeah, definitely. In a nutshell, identity is about controlling who can access what, when, where, and how. And this is for both human users and compute and data resources, which, by the way, both of these are increasing in numbers as more and more of these customers move onto the cloud. And really the complexity comes in when they are trying to understand what is their identity strategy, but getting that right on paper is one thing, but translating that into JSON policies, for example, is where the complexity really comes in. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you take an IAM policy, the terminology used is not easy for most users. You have actions, resources, principal, not principal, effect, not action, condition, not resource. All of this defines the who can access what, when, where, and how. And again, both for human users and the compute and data resources. So as you can imagine, it can become very confusing very quickly. The other thing I see is that most companies will provide more access than required because they either don't want to impede productivity or introduce friction, or they just want something to work. The other thing that I think is very important, which companies struggle with, is number one, just not having that holistic visibility into knowing who can access what, when, where, and how in the environment. And then number two, if they do get that visibility, being able to understand what it means in as near layman terms as possible. A lot of organizations don't understand the complexity of the cloud. I'll give you an example. When I was at AWS, we saw lots of accounts getting compromised. We provided recommendations to the customers to quote unquote sanitize their account, which is essentially the identity that was compromised, cleaning up the credentials. But time and time again, customers would come back with questions rather than actions because they didn't quite understand what we were explaining.
No, that's really helpful. And I think to kind of hone in on a few of the things I wrote down from what you were talking about there was, that who and what aspect and the complexity of dealing with that, and how organizations don't want to kind of hamper their workers, but also balance the security risk. So I guess a question to kind of follow up a bit as we lead into this product, Sudarsan, is how do we actually reduce our attack surface then in regards to identity as we think about this complexity of the who and the what?
Sure. Before we even get into reducing the attack surface, one needs to know how big of an attack surface does an organization have, right? Surfacing risk is the most critical part, and before you understand the size of the attack surface. Some of the basic risks that an organization should be thinking about in the cloud native world is, do we know how your credentials are being used today and who's using it, and what service are they being used on? Are there any dormant roles that can be used as a backdoor? Are there any overly permissive or power users or privileged users in your environment? Making sure that the basic IAM hygiene is followed, for example, locking access to your access keys, making sure your users have MFA turned on when they try to access those consoles. So some of the ways that you can think about reducing an attack surface through these best practices and security compensatory controls.
No, that's perfect. I think that's actually a good transition point to kind of our next section here, which is, we've just set that baseline and foundation of, okay, what actually is the world of cloud identity and entitlements as we see it? But how do threat actors actually move to exploit those gaps we just talked about? How do they live in that complexity and kind of thrive in that? So, Andre, I know you have a lot of experience based off of this. How do threat actors actually think? And, maybe a question around that would be, how do we see them think? And is there a disconnect between those two?
Yeah, definitely. Threat actors are cloud security experts, period. They can identify and exploit gaps in an organization's identity strategy much quicker than most people skilled in this domain can. And, there are several exploitation frameworks out there which enable them to do so very quickly. An example is Paku by Rhino Security Labs, which enables them to do this. Threat actors are constantly thinking about all the different permutations of how to escalate privileges, how to move laterally, exfiltrate data, and or implement ransomware based on one or multiple permissions that they have access to. Whereas most organizations don't even think about that. Most organizations are really just trying to allow the legitimate user to do what they need to do without slowing down their productivity, and not really thinking through, if a threat actor were to gain permission, how could they move laterally or exfiltrate data or escalate the privileges? But that being said, because threat actors have a behavioral pattern that's unique to these MOs, or they use certain exploitation frameworks to conduct their activity, it actually leaves a trail or pattern that organizations can use by configuring alerts whenever these behavioral patterns are detected in their account. Again, go back to my AWS days, we saw unique patterns and identifiers for repeat threat actors to where we became really good at detecting their MO and being able to label their activity.
No, that's really helpful. And there's a couple of things that stood out for me from what you just talked about there. And just the idea of, and I'll use that quote again, cloud security experts. Threat actors really have become cloud security experts. And I'm really interested in kind of seeing you dig into that idea of breaking down those behavioral patterns. But I did want to ask Sudarsan a question first, just kind of following up after Andre just mentioned that. Andre just walked us through that red team mentality of, how do threat actors think? But, we've been building out this KIM product. I'm curious, can you provide some insight into kind of how we defenders want to think about the cloud?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the first things that you have to think about is to, when you want to reduce your attack surface, there should be some protective mechanisms that you put it in your cloud environment. When I say protective mechanisms, you need to make sure you understand who your privileged users are. You understand who your overly permissive users are. Once you have that perspective, then you can go ahead and try to reduce that attack surface so that you can avoid those kind of problems that Andre is talking about.
Nice. Awesome. No, that's really helpful as we think about our mentality between how threat actors think and how defenders think. Andre, I know you've kind of set up this really interesting use case of privilege escalation, kind of focusing on identity. Would you mind walking us through it?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, excuse my elementary type of drawing here, but
No, it's
thought I would
great.
get
I love
the
it. I love the labels. I love the numbers. It's all fantastic. Thanks.
So what I'm going to walk you through is a very simple way to escalate privileges when, this was seen in a real live organization where an organization, had the best intentions, right? An IAM role that had EC2 full permissions and only EC2 full permissions. So on the left-hand side, you have the attacker, you have, two shells that are open. Step number one is SSRF, right? Server-side request forgery. Now, an EC2 instance that runs an application, in my time at AWS, we saw these instances get popped time and time again for various reasons, either SSRF, either a Jenkins server running on it that didn't have the appropriate administrative password set, whatever the reason, but getting access to the metadata of an instance is a lot easier than most organizations want to believe. So for the purposes of this demo, let's assume server-side request forgery occurred. The actor was able to steal the metadata from that EC2 instance, which had an IAM role called EC2 only devs. And again, that IAM role only had EC2 full permissions and nothing else. The attacker took that data. Step number 3, they could either export it into environment and then begin using those credentials to authenticate into AWS, or they could enter it into the exploitation tool I mentioned earlier called Paku. Once they're in Paku, for example, they could then go and begin performing reconnaissance. So what this attacker was able to do is identify A, what permissions those credentials had, B, scan the full EC2 fleet that was available in the region, and then C, they were able to identify which IAM roles were attached to those instances. So in this example, the attacker found an EC2 instance that was stopped, but it had the instance profile dev admin attached to it. So what the threat actor did is they initiated a startup of that EC2 instance, but injected user data into that instance on startup. And the payload in that user data was a reverse shell. Now, as you can imagine, what they did is once that reverse shell was able to call back to the listener, which by the way, step number 5, they set up a listener. So as soon as the EC2 that has dev admin IAM role attached to it gets a connection, it initiates that reverse shell back to the attacker. At that point, the attacker is able to do the same that he did in step number 1, which is steal the credentials, the metadata. And instead of doing the SSRF, all they do is a curl on the IAM role temporary credentials, and they have the secret key, the access key, and the token. And at that point, the attacker now has full permissions on the entire account. And again, there were 0 IAM permissions associated with this, but because of the simple example, an attacker was able to go ahead and gain full admin permissions.
Wow, no, thank you so much for walking us through that. And I think you did a great job kind of breaking it down and making it easy to understand, kind of going through each step. But what was alarming to me was that at almost every step, the attacker had multiple options to exploit here. In the first step, you're talking about SSRF and a few other options like curling and things like that. But I guess, one of my first thoughts after hearing you walk through this is, how would we even begin addressing an attack or identity gap like the one you just walked through?
Yeah, I'd recommend, firstly, just getting that holistic visibility into knowing who can access what, when, where, and how in the environment. Number 2, truly understanding what certain permissions mean. In the example I gave, the intentions were probably well intended. Full EC2 permission, there's 0 IAM permission. IAM is all they need to get access to an environment. But in this example, you can clearly see how they were able to get those administrative permissions by having full EC2 permissions. And then thirdly is thinking like a threat actor. And what I mean by this, when assigning those permissions, for example, on that EC2 IAM role, if the threat actor mentality was applied, and now knowing this example, I bet you the organization would have thought twice about applying full EC2 permissions, because if they had thought like a threat actor, they would have seen how the threat actor could have moved laterally. They could have gained privilege escalation through the account, and they probably would have gone back and said, let's really scrutinize which EC2 actions that EC2 instance actually needs.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think that mentality of thinking like a threat actor becomes so useful as you're kind of operationalizing these solutions or actually building these solutions. So kind of with that in mind, I guess, Sudarsan, you've talked about it before, and you kind of alluded to it on this call a little bit, but you've mentioned so much about the mean time to know, the idea that as quickly as possible, can we get that who, what, when, where, and how that Andre's talked so much about. So I just kind of wanted to ask, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that mean time to know, and how do you reduce this mean time to knowledge?
Correct. So mean time to know, the way that I think about this is, if I'm a security operations guy, if you want to get to those kind of answers based on the questions, like, for example, if you want to know EC2, who else has EC2 full access in my environment, right? Or given a specific identity, how do you know if that identity has full access to other services within my environment, not only EC2, like S3, for example, right? If you have to get that answer within your AWS console today, you have to jump through multiple places. You have to do some manual steps, take your white paper, write it down. There's a lot of calculation that you have to do, but that means your mean time to know is like, it's going to take some time, half a day, or depending on what you're trying to search for, trying to find the needle in the haystack. So in that regard, the way that we help our customers, this probably is a great place to show how Uptycs can help in terms of reducing your mean time to know, is what I describe this as. Before we get into the mean time to know, something just want to share what Uptycs provides today. So today, if you see, this is a very high level risk dashboard that we talked about earlier. How do you surface the risk? How do you know what is my overall attack surface? This provides an overall idea about, we scan the entire IAM infrastructure within the cloud and come up with the list of users who we deem privileged. For example, the EC2, the star.start permissions that Andre was talking about, we are able to surface those identities right off the bat once we scan your environment. Similarly, the EC2 :* where he talked about all-inclusive permissions for EC2 as a service, we deem it as overly permissive identity, right? We surface all of them right away in an environment so that you can take some actions based on that. Not only the permissions, but also we talked about the access keys. For example, if the access keys are at risk in your environment, because access keys, whether it's a permanent access keys or temporary access credentials, those are going to be one of the entry points as a backdoor for attackers to gain access into your environment. You want to make sure those access keys are visible for you as a security operations guy, so that you can take some remediative actions if needed. And so all in all, we provide the overall risk in your environment. And so here is a current risk, which is basically a point in time risk. And you can figure out if your risk is changing over a period of time, and see if you want to improve your processes, or if you want to add more security controls within your mix. So this is kind of a high level risk dashboard. Coming back to the mean time to know. So what I described, so as I'm talking about, how do you know an EC2, for example, we talked about EC2, right? So let's take, in this case, I want to search for EC2, right? I want to search for EC2 here. When I search, in the specific example Andre gave, is one role that had a full permission to EC2, right? Which is basically EC2 only devs, right? So what you see here, this one, EC2 only devs, is the role that Andre is talking about that has access to EC2. Now, how do we know if there are other roles that have more permissions similar to EC2 only devs? How do you know that, right? If you want to get that answer, that goes back to the mean time to know that you talked about. It's going to take a while for me to get that answer. But in this case here, you can see that I can get all that answer right out of the bat immediately. I can say, show me all the access paths that have access to EC2. I can see the bunch of roles that can make that connection to EC2. And even in those roles, we can find out what kind of permissions do these roles have, right? Do they have a read permission? Do they have a write permission? Or whatever the list of permissions that you want to drill down and say, okay, I don't have to worry about a specific role because it's read only. Whereas some roles have to be worried about because they have permissions management, right? So that is where the mean time to know is really fast in this case. Whereas in AWS, if you have to go through AWS console, it's going to take a while. You can do it, but it's going to take a while and a lot of manual processes involved, right? The other part is, even if you know what roles are connected to EC2, how do you know who can assume that role, right? Assuming a role is one of the biggest challenges, whether the assumption can be done from within an account or external to your account. So we also provide some details around who can assume a role. So in this case, there is a role called CSP and EC2 creation role. You can find out who are the users that can assume this role as well, right? So you need to have that level of depth to understand who can make an impact on your EC2 instance. The other part is, now you know that EC2 dev only role that we talked about earlier. How do you reduce the permissions for that role, right? Once you know it's really big, but you don't know whether somebody is using that account, somebody is not using that account. Here's where we help customers with get to the least privilege model. We look for the log data, we look at historical log data and find out what was used, what was not used. And then based on that, we try to provide some recommendations as to, okay, here are the things that you can remove versus keep existing permissions based on the usage itself.
Wow, thanks, Sudarsan. That's fantastic. And I think you did a great job kind of linking that back to Andre's specific use case. So Andre had me pretty spooked, but now after you walked us through that, I feel a little bit better now about having some solutions to actually implement. And I think kind of going back to that idea of mean time to know, it was really helpful for me having that UI in two different formats. You know, the idea of being able to visualize it through that graph, but also have just kind of a table summary on the side to be able to play around with or kind of use that data on hand. So that's really helpful. I do want to pause for a second here. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Let us know. I've seen a couple questions come in already, so I'll go ahead and kick that off. But if you have anything, please just let us know. So one of the first ones, I'll just kind of keep the ball rolling with kind of the platform itself, Sudarsan. How are we actually calculating the identity posture risk scores that you showed off at the very beginning?
Yeah, there are multiple factors that goes into the definition. We have a normalized weighted score depending on the factors. Some of them have higher weight than the others. For example, we look for root account access keys. We look for root account usage, or if there is a role created that establishes a third-party connection, or even some permissions within a policy that can expose credentials, potentially expose credentials. We take all that into consideration and can determine the risk score for that environment.
That's really helpful. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think, another question we have come in that maybe is more applicable to you, Andre, a question asking about, the differences between on-prem versus cloud identity solutions. So maybe you can kind of answer that.
Yeah, it's definitely a paradigm shift, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but, on-prem, it really came down to your firewalls, your NACLs, and then general security, like usernames, maybe you have an AD server. And really that was to control who got in and out of quote unquote the moat. Whereas cloud, it's much more than that. It's now both human users, compute and data resources, all of these have identities. And, I think the shift in paradigm shift for customers is really management of these identities and the different permutations that they can have access to is a game changer. And I think this is where organizations are what they're struggling with and where they should focus.
No, that's really helpful. And I think kind of bringing it all together in a way, kind of throughout this presentation, you've talked about kind of the depth of telemetry that we have, guys, and kind of that foundation we have to really analyze this complex cloud environment. So one thing that I always like to say is that Uptycs does a really good job of kind of finding that needle in the haystack for you, but also having that haystack of data on the side. And I think, Andre, when you walked us through that use case, we can see just how important it is to have that visibility and reach and to have that insight into your environment and really reduce the complexity in the cloud. And then Sudarsan, when you walked us through the actual use case itself, I think it was easy to see how that telemetry kind of brings itself out into tangible insights. So I do want to be mindful of everyone's time here, looking at the clock. So yeah, any parting thoughts between you two? I'd love to hear kind of, anything we couldn't touch on in full today, or just any final thoughts you have. Sudarsan?
Yeah, so Identity is the firewall in the cloud. So you can make and break things through not having the right configuration, the right security principles. So make sure you follow the basic hygienes when it comes to identity, and surfacing all the risk is key to knowing who can do what in your environment.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. Andre, any final thoughts?
Yeah, a couple things I want to leave the listeners with is, again, cloud is becoming more and more complex, and so is identity. Threat actors are cloud security experts, and specifically they're cloud identity experts, whether we want to believe it or not. Organizations should prioritize their identity strategy and make sure it's not being decided on in a vacuum. And what do I mean by that? But having the subject matter experts in the room who can really ask the hard questions and think through their identity strategy from various angles, one of them being a threat actor. And I think lastly is just gaining the knowledge to understand what does this all mean. Earlier I mentioned about the complexity of a JSON policy, for example. Just being able to understand what each of that means, I think, is a great opportunity to put your company ahead. I think back to my AWS days, and we saw repeat actors compromising hundreds, thousands of accounts. And like I mentioned, we would notify customers and ask them to sanitize their account. And in the subscription, we would try and be as simple as we could, giving them instructions on how to do it. Time and time again, there were many more questions that came back than those actually answers. And by the way, I do want to give a shout out to the AWS team focusing on this in the fraud prevention group. I think they're doing a fantastic job. So in the end, getting that holistic view as well as understanding what it means is probably the biggest takeaway I want to have folks leave with.
No, that's fantastic. And I love that shout out as well. So thank you everyone who joined us this month on the Uptycs Live. A big thank you to Andre, a big thank you to Sudarsan for kind of walking us through so much. I have put my email down below, and both Andre and Sudarsan are also very reachable and love talking about this, anything in security, anything in privacy. So definitely, if you had any questions that we couldn't answer today or that you just kind of had in the back of your mind, but you'd love to touch base on later, definitely reach out. We love these conversations, and we're really excited to have them and get to kind of evangelize these solutions with you all. So thank you all so much for joining us this month. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.